You're on with Lauren Zayu for Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, a show about what you say, how you say it, and what to do after it's said. We'll talk about communications and messaging blunders, successes, distractions, and what all of it means for you. Join me for a crash course in what you need to know in politics and issues driving the 2020 elections. Hello, and welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. I'm your host, Lauren Zayu. This season, we're chronicling the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. They've put forth a very ambitious agenda on the campaign trail, and I'm eager to get started. Moving on to today's show, today we're talking about immigration. So much of what the previous administration's awful rhetoric and actions on the campaign trail and in office were targeted against immigrant communities. My two guests today have been on the front lines for immigration reform for years, personally and professionally. Diana Pliego works at the National Immigration Law Center as a policy associate in the DC office. In her role, she works on a range of issues, including protection for DACA recipients and fighting immigration enforcement. She conducts policy research, analyzes and tracks legislation, and develops materials for movement and field partners, as well as congressional advocacy. As an immigrant with a passion for social justice, Diana earned her bachelor's degree at Columbia College in Community and Policy Advocacy. While an undergrad, she helped found a grassroots organization called Young Immigrants in Action in South Carolina. She organized and trained immigrants from across the state to advocate for themselves and their communities. Since then, she's worked on federal policy for faith-based social justice lobbying and as a campaign field organizer before continuing her work with immigrants' rights. She currently serves on the board of the National Justice for Our Neighbors, a network of legal service sites that provide free or low-cost faith-based immigration legal services to low-income immigrants, families, refugees, and asylum-seekers. We also have with us Sarah Benitez, who directs the Faith and Public Life Organizing Department, where she works to empower clergy and lay leaders of all faith traditions to lead their communities and promote their values. She's frequently humbled by how many faith leaders selflessly serve and mobilize their communities for social justice. With that being said, I'm excited to welcome to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, Sarah Benitez and Diana Pliego. Hello.
Hi.
How are we today?
Great.
Yes, good.
As well as can be in these times.
Yeah, definitely. I see you there. I'm so excited to have y'all. I think that the immigration conversation is well overdue on my podcast, so I appreciate y'all coming on to have it with us. And I know that these next 100 days, the Biden-Harris administration has offered a lot of different things on immigration. And so we'll get into that. But first, I want you to introduce yourselves, kind of say like your background and how you came into this work.
My name is Diana Pliego, as Lauren said, and I'm immigrant from Mexico. I'm a DACA recipient. For those who don't know, that just means that I have been in the U.S. since I was very little. This is my home. I don't know any other country as home, but my status isn't fully like everyone else's. And so I'm someone who grew up all over this country, and I think as a little background for like my career in college, I did go to Columbia College, which is a women's college. And there I had the opportunity to actually design my major in community and policy advocacy, because it was actually in college where I realized that I didn't just have to let all of these immigration things kind of happen to me. I could actually do something for myself and my community. And so I decided to make a career out of it. And I've been using that education ever since. During that time, I was able to organize with youth all across the state with an organization called Young Immigrants in Action in South Carolina. And since then, I have worked on, as a field organizer on campaigns, I've worked at faith social justice spaces, and now I'm at the National Immigration Law Center working as a policy advocate there, working for my community for low-income immigrants in particular. So that's just a little bit about me. I'm happy to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, good to be here. Great with both of you. And personally, I'm just counting down the hours until we have that change in administration that we so much need and are looking forward to, and so many people organized to make happen, and so many voters voted for. So very much looking forward to that and kind of counting down. I would say for myself, I grew up in Southeast Idaho. My father is an immigrant from Venezuela and came on a student visa. And my mom's family is Mexican American and have been in the United States for many generations before even it was the United States, in New Mexico and Colorado. So I came from a community that was very predominantly white, but grew up playing with and in community with kids whose parents were undocumented or who they were themselves. And the 90s, when I was like in middle school, was when some of the really awful attacks on immigrants were taking place in California through Prop 187. And it was sort of my awakening to the like awareness that there were different status and that's still something, I'll be honest, like as a person, I just don't comprehend. Like, how is it that as people, we can give and treat differently based on a legal status, but also just in the way, not just how people's status are, but in how we look and how people perceive us. And so that was the beginning of my kind of sense that was a great injustice and a need to be changed and fixed. And so that's been a kind of through line in my sort of education and career. 2006, when I came to DC, was the kind of height of another wave of the immigrant rights movement. And I was really eager to get involved. I ended up at the National Council of La Raza then, which is now Unidos US, working on advocacy around many policies that impact the Latino community, both immigrant and multi-generation, that have been in the United States. And then in the last few years have transitioned into faith-based organizing with lots of really amazing advocates and leaders across the country to keep on that North Star around immigration reform and hopefully even more than that.
Thank you both for the work that you do and the space in which you're operating right now. And Sarah's last line there, I kind of want to talk about as far as like the North Star, right? So when we're talking about immigration, what's the marker of progress? What is the goal? What are we working for? And more than that, like how can you show that progress is made? I asked this question because I know there was a lot of conversation about President Obama versus President Trump and who was actually a friend to immigrants. And so we know that Trump had awful rhetoric, but we also knew some of the policies of the Obama administration led to a lot of deportations. And so what does progress look like as an immigration activist and advocate?
Yeah, I mean, I can start us off here as well. I mean, I think for me, I think it's really big picture, but at the same time, it starts very locally. And it may sound super cliche, but I think it's what people think and believe about immigrants, right? Because we can advocate for policy change all day and know in our hearts and minds that it's the right thing to do to give people status, to provide them with access to healthcare, to make sure that they're included in all these other relief bills right now with COVID. But if people don't believe in their hearts that people are deserving, then we're never going to achieve that change. And so for me, I think I see progress when the conversation, the narrative, when the general public is changing their perception on who immigrants are and just moves in a direction where we're like, hey, why are we excluding them, right? And then that obviously we can see in the change in Congress and people in power making different policy decisions. But I think a lot of that has to do with how we talk and see immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Diana is exactly right, that it is starting, there are lots of immediate things that will have hopefully an immediate impact on a lot of people's lives that I'm very hopeful, very excited to see happen very, very soon. Really in the coming days, the Biden-Harris administration has recently committed to sort of a lot of executive actions in the first few days that would undo a lot of the harmful policies of the Trump administration. I was just reading this morning, there were over 1,000 policies attacking immigrants since 2017, really beginning from the very beginning of the Trump administration. So there's lots of harms to be undone. And then there is greater work to do that were the policies that were in place before. So, a stay on deportations would make an immediate impact on people who, for example, right now are living in sanctuary in churches and have been for several years, some of them, including 2 women immigrant leaders we work with through the organization I work at, Faith in Public Life in Columbus, Ohio. Edith Espinal and Miriam Vargas have been living in churches in Ohio to be able to stay with their families for Edith, I think going on 3 years. So immediate changes that would make their life change instantly, and their families would be a stay on deportation, as well as extension and protection of DACA, TPS, introduction of a comprehensive immigration reform. So we know those things, I think, are coming. There's been commitment from the incoming administration very recently with calls with immigration advocates and organizations. And I think it is that bigger piece that Diana said, and it really, in looking to leadership that's in office, of like, how are they talking about immigration and immigrants, and centering people and humanizing, so that the way that we talk and think, and what the long-term change that's needed, for people to hear over and over, that we're talking about our neighbors. We're talking about also, what is it in the 21st century to be a globalized society? What is it to overturn white supremacist ideologies that have governed our immigration policy, and why we have the system that we do that limits immigration from neighboring countries in Latin America, right? Or from other parts of the world, like the numbers of visas, things like that. So I think those are some of the things that I would be looking to, and that I think others will be too, from the Biden Harris, both themselves, from President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and also the rest of their administration. How are they talking about people in our communities who are our neighbors, and how we view this as a policy issue that is about people in our community?
Yeah, and I will say, all of those things I think are the things we're going to be looking for in these next few days. And hopefully we're really busy in really good ways in these next few weeks because of all the good that is coming down the pipeline, and not for the reasons we have been these past 4 years, right? And I think too, as a movement, as an immigration movement, we have seen a lot of progress. And I personally really hope that President-elect Biden and his administration see that they don't just come in and, start from where, he left off with the Obama administration, that he recognizes that not only has the immigrant rights move evolved, but our allies and people in Congress have evolved. We took advantage of these past 4 years, and we're building progress, introducing bills and gaining support for things that were more inclusive, for things we were fighting against narratives of criminalizing immigrants, understanding that immigrant communities and communities of color are often over-policed, and that there's no reason to include exclusions for communities that are being oppressed for those reasons, right? And so there's a lot of progress I think that has been made, and I hope for boldness. I hope for that to me is a measure of progress, is what are you coming in with, and what will you stand by? A lot of times I think, there's a lot of compromise that is done in the name of bipartisanship, but I think progress for me in this incoming administration personally would be to not appease a party that has clearly shown their colors, the true colors, time and time again, that they have no interest in actually doing good for the immigrant community. And really all they're doing is perpetrating white supremacy with the policies that they support. They've enabled white supremacy for the past 4 years. And so, if you're going in seeking bipartisanship, to keep that in mind. Who are you trying to work with? And so for me, I think progress in policy is going to be standing boldly next to policy that is as inclusive as possible, and that is rooted in the humanity of people, right? Not just in what people can contribute, right, to the United States, quote unquote, but just recognizing that people are inherently worthy. And that's something that I, as a person of the Christian faith, firmly believe. And if we have also politicians in power who claim to be followers of Jesus in particular and other faiths, I would hope that they would believe that and act on it with their immigration policies as well.
I love the way both of you framed people being what's most important in this conversation, and that being our marker of progress. How are people being treated? Because I do think it's very easy to get bogged down in the policy nuts and bolts of things. And so to have the reference point that people are going to be our indicator of progress, I definitely support that as an idea. And somewhat segueing into our hold up notion, what are some of the things, particularly you, Sarah, that you think that need to be added to the conversation on immigration that don't get the weight they deserve.
I think Diana really is getting at it around how do we show that we value the innate human dignity of each person in our policies, right? So there is a reality that policy does impact real people's lives. Numbers of deportations, each of those numbers is a person who is part of a family, part of a community. And, yes, that was there were high numbers of deportations carried out by the Obama administration. Although I would just note, like, in a very vastly different from what has happened in the last 4 years. So while there was harm, and not to value very much the individual weight of each of those to families and communities, drastically different from 1,000 sort of anti-immigrant, immigrant attacking policies. And at the same time, keeping in mind what were the political calculus, and calculations being made at that time for that and why that was happening, right? It was because our policy, my understanding of it is that there was a political efficacy calculation being made that if we can show, by we, the Obama administration, Democrats, that we are tough on immigration, then we will get immigration reform. And so to get reform for the 11 million people in the United States will make this sort of bargain. Of course, that didn't pan out that way because the GOP is not committed to solution in the long term. The majority, I would say. I think there's a few lawmakers who do see that. And what all of that leaves out is, again, what are our values as a country and how are we valuing people? That gets into a place that, at some point we'll probably come to again fairly soon, if immigration reform does get introduced soon, around what are the political compromises, what are the exchanges that are willing to be made. And as soon as that starts happening, we lose sight of who are the people. When we talk about border security, there are communities that live all along the border that impacts. There are American, immigrants and non-immigrants, that's a very real impact. What does that really mean? And when we say, even now I was reading about, there's a caravan of migrants that are coming from Honduras that are in Guatemala right now. And the news is already telling it as a story of it's a challenge for the Biden administration in the coming days. How are they going to respond? What are they going to say instead of, and I think this is where the challenge for an incoming administration and even for the immigrant rights movement and any leaders and people who want to stand with that, to be thoughtful about, we want to center people and human needs and human dignity first. And then what are the policy and political implications from my perspective? I think especially because we're not, those of us not in elected office, that is what we are calling those who are too. And especially, again, from the perspective of faith, speaking around faith leaders and people in faith communities, this is where our leadership and calling us to our values, I think, is so important, and that gets kind of put second or after the immediate political kind of implications. And so I think it's resisting that pull of the way the media is trying to tell the story, the way the inside baseball politics of DC and policy making, and recentering. What does it mean to be living out our values, both as a country, as people of faith, whatever our faith traditions are, and then what needs to happen so that those values are being lived out.
Yeah, I just want to second all of that. All of it, just second all of that. And I think the only thing that I would add, which I think we've been kind of talking about as well, is just often the conversation for years has been around, this thing called quote unquote comprehensive immigration reform, which is really just another way of saying, okay, we're going to give legalization in exchange for X, Y, and Z of enforcement, X, Y, and Z of things that will actually harm the immigrant community. And I think what I think we need to hold up about is and really look at that is why do we have to do that? Why? Why can't we just do good for the sake of doing good? We have had many people in the Republican Party say oh, yes, we support dreamers. I'm what they call me, a dreamer. We support immigrant youth, but they refuse to actually just support a bill that will give me a a path to citizenship unless they can also harm the rest of my community, unless they can harm my parents, unless they can do something that I am telling you up front is going to harm me, and I'm saying no to that. I don't want that. I don't want to be given something in exchange for throwing the rest of my community under the bus. And so I think that's something that I think is often missing, is that we don't need to do that. And I think we need more politicians standing up and boldly saying that we don't need to do that. And particularly, I know it's narrow margins in the Senate, right? But this is going to be a trifecta. We have both chambers in Congress that are Democratic, and we have the president who's Democratic. And again, understanding that there's still political calculuses that will need to be made because of just how things need to be passed into law with bipartisan support. I think this administration and Congress need to be doing everything they can to really hold the line on doing good without doing harm. And I think that's just something that we need to take a pause and really think about. Listen to the immigrant community, listen to our allies, listen to the fact that we're saying enough is enough. You have been promising for years and you're not delivering, and people are hurting. And I'll just add that also, I think something that we often talk about, we think that legalization is going to be the fix-all to everything, and that's just not true. There's so many things that affect our immigrant community. We care about healthcare, we care about education, and there's so many other really, I think popular issues now that I think people think that the immigrant community doesn't care about. They're like, oh, as soon as you give them status, that they're going to be okay. And I think that that's just not true. And we need to recognize that we need more than that. And there's so many other places in policy where we need to be included, like the COVID relief bills, making sure that we're recognizing not just the contributions, but again, the inherent worthiness that people deserve, access to the healthcare and to the economic relief that is being given, but especially so when they are paying taxes and they're not seeing any return in the time of need that we're facing.
I completely agree with both of you. Definitely. I think that so much of what you're pointing out shows that people aren't the center of this conversation, right? Because I do think that particularly communities of color end up bogged down in these singular single issue care groups that aren't true, right? Like you're saying, immigrants care about a host of different issues. We also know that immigrants come in a host of colors from various countries. And so the idea that it's this one particular group that has this set of issues, no, we're all intersecting in different points in this conversation. And so I definitely think that seeing them as people would be would ironically be the most comprehensive step, because therein you would understand how all of these other issues impact them as well. And what bothers me so much is I do think that often people can try to silver bullet these conversations in communities, right? So it's oh, all they need is X. And it's no, we all need all of it because our lives are impacted by all these different issues. And so I appreciate y'all really weighing on that, because as you were talking, Deanna, about people think legalization solves everything, so much that we've seen, ironically, in the Trump administration is how interwoven these issues are, and that it's never just one thing. And so I really appreciate you pointing that out. And something that I guess, if we were to move into what we're not sorry about, is this idea for me that I'm never going to be sorry for betting on people, if that makes sense. I feel so much of our policy views people through the lens of the worst case possible. And so what I'm not going to be sorry for is saying okay, so we could have this conversation from the perspective of everyone trying to get over and everyone being a scammer and everyone being someone who wants to take advantage of the system. Or we could say let's bet on the general human virtue of people. Let's bet on people's desire to be good and provide for their families and make sure that everyone is taken care of. Let's come at it from that perspective, because I do think the way we end up with so much rigidness and a conversation around the right types of people and all the awful things that sometimes come out of these conversations is viewing people from the worst possible place that could ever happen. And unfortunately, I do think so much of our policy has made that the norm. And that's just a really unfortunate place to be. And so that's what I would say I'm not sorry for. Diana, what are you unapologetic about?
Oh, man. I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, so but it still feels like a strange thing to say. So I am unapologetic about the fact that my parents did nothing wrong. A lot of times, when we're discussing policy for just immigrant youth, certain people, certain parties in particular, will say that, I came here through no fault of my own. And what that then does is, well, then whose fault was it? And so then who gets punished for that? And that would be, of course, my parents. And I just want to, for the record, my parents did nothing wrong. My parents came here to give me a better life. And in addition to that, they came here because Mexico was in a recession that was actually caused by international trade deals that the U.S. had a hand in. And even to this day, when there's international policy being cemented, immigration advocates will say, hey, this is going to cause another immigration cycle. You're going to see the effects of this in 10, 20 years. And oftentimes we're not listened to. And so the only people who get hurt in the process are immigrants, right? Are people. And so I just want to state that they did nothing wrong. They did what they had to do to provide for us. My parents always just tell me that they did absolutely everything to get a job when they were in Mexico. But it wasn't like here where you might see, a help wanted sign at a place with minimum wage, but nobody wants that necessarily. No. There was nothing. People in their church were creating jobs when they were barely staying afloat, creating jobs for their friends and community to try to help them because there was just nothing. And my parents had 2 children and another on the way. And my dad did what he had to do to provide for us. And again, the U.S. was complicit in that. So no, they didn't do anything wrong. And so I don't apologize for fighting for everyone. I don't apologize for fighting for those who might have something on their criminal record. But why were they forced into that to do that crime? What was that crime? Was it driving without a driver's license because they don't have legal status because they couldn't access it? What crimes are we talking about? I think I'm just not going to apologize for giving people second chances. I'm not going to apologize for, I think, what I consider living out my faith. And I think if you're a person of the Christian faith and you cannot see how Jesus would be welcoming immigrants and refugees, then we just have a different faith then. and I don't know what else to tell you because we are here and we're not going anywhere because this is my home. And I'm going to continue fighting, not just for me and my family, but also to change the perspective that we have to treat others who aren't from here as less than, because that's just not what my faith stands for.
Amen. And thank you for sharing it in that perspective. I love the your parents did nothing wrong. Because again, people do what they have to do to provide for their families. And the way that statement is said, through no fault of your own, it does imply fault, relies with someone. And so I appreciate you unpacking that and that being a problem. Sarah, how about you?
I just thank you, Diana, and for your sharing that, but also yes, absolutely, that I absolutely support that not only did your parents not do anything wrong, but neither did anyone else who has come here without status or who has overstayed a visa. It is wrong. What is wrong and what I'm not apologetic about is the way that our system has created a structure of criminalization around migration. In the Catholic tradition, which is my faith tradition, migration is a right. The right of people to seek a better life or safety, whether they have a family or not, whether they're able to work or not. The innate dignity and value of each person is also the innate right to live and move where you need to. People are on the move. And so that's something that I'm not apologetic about, and that I think more of us should be, of how do we think in a different frame and stop thinking in terms of the one that's been created for us around criminalizing people. And a lot of the reason that was created was around a system of what is like a white supremacist ideology for a long time that's built into our immigration system and our understanding of that in this country. And so I think one thing I'm not apologetic about is unpacking that and really doing more thoughtfulness and conversation around, especially for people of faith, of what does it mean to not claim ownership over a place, right? It's like, this is not just belong to people who already live here, and instead a community, and what is a beloved community that accepts and welcomes everyone fully. I would also add to, not only is the United States complicit, but so are all of us in the United States who have benefited from the immigration policies that support low-cost labor, people like Diana's parents and other people like I grew up with who worked in fields at low wages so that the rest of us could buy food at a cheaper price or go eat at restaurants or anything. We are all part of a system that has supported the dehumanization of our neighbors, the not full integration into our communities and welcoming of people, and instead devalued them for, one, their labor, and then also at the risk of, or the benefit of a non-legal status meant lower wages for them and their families, a way for us to ignore and not look at what our needs are as a whole community, and value all people. And so that's something I'm very conscious of. I think we all should be around, what does that mean to undo that and to do better in the long run? Yeah,
I definitely agree with all of that. And I think just one more thing, if I could add here, for folks who their top argument or their top hesitation for supporting undocumented immigrants might be, well, they still broke the law. At the end of the day, they broke the law, and therefore that has consequence. Just want to remind you that the law is not always right. Law does not equal justice. Our history shows that clearly. Even just the last 4 years show us clearly. Not only is the law not always right, but it is not applied equally and fairly. And so that's why we're fighting to change the law, to reflect our values, to reflect common humanity, common human decency toward one another. So I encourage you, if that's your hesitation for whatever reason, or your friend's hesitation, to just remind them, the law is not the end all be all. It is our job to create a law and apply the law in a fair and just manner that reflects our values. Particularly, I would say, if you are a person of faith, how do we do that? How do we have these conversations, change the narrative, and then have that lead to policy change that truly impacts people's lives for the better?
I agree with you both. And while we're here, actually, what are some of the more common misnomers about immigration on the left? Diana, your statement about, like, well, they still broke the law. I do think a lot of people think that, or a lot of people wrestle with that. And so are there any other, I guess, well-meaning misnomers that people have about immigrants that you think could help shift this narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think one that is really common misconception, obviously, is that, immigrants, don't pay taxes, that that they are some sort of charge on our society. That's not true. Many immigrants, I would say most, pay taxes. This thing called an ITIN number, a tax ID number. And those immigrants were expressly left out of the first COVID relief bill. And my organization and many others fought very heavily and were trying to get Congress to say, hey, at least, provide this relief for those who, they have who those who are paying taxes. Mm-hmm. And even because the CARES package actually also went as far as to deny relief to anyone who was married to someone undocumented. So if they were a legal resident, a U.S. citizen, and they were married to someone without status, they did not get a relief check. And we're saying everyone should get it, first of all. And so we were thankfully able in this next round to see those folks who were part of that mixed status family get that relief, but they're still leaving out undocumented immigrants who pay taxes. And again, I think everyone should be getting their relief, but I think it's entirely hypocritical that for years people say, well, we would support immigrants so long as they pay their fair share. They have been, and you just blatantly told us that you don't care about that. So it's not about their economic contribution. It's just that you are racist. Is that too bold to say? That you don't like immigrants, you're xenophobic. That's how I feel. That's how I see it. That's how I perceived it. And so that's definitely one that comes to mind. But again, I don't think it should be based on people's economic contribution. I think it should be based on their inherent worthiness. That's just the top one that comes to mind. But Sarah, please feel free to add, because I think there's so many.
There are so many. I know. I was just thinking, Diana, about for a long time, Democrats would running for office in congressional seats or states, where, and even presidential candidates would say, well, I have to, we can't run on a very aggressively pro-immigrant agenda, or we have to say that we're going to have enforcement, or that there would be a trade-off. And from 2018 to this year's election shows that's not the case. In Georgia, both of the, John Ossoff and Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock both ran on a pro-immigrant agenda in Georgia and won for office, right? So I think one of the first things that needs to be undone, and there's tons of research and the last few years and people who study like political opinion and how that's been shifting and where that is an old concept, and it's much more nuanced and more complex and not necessarily true anymore at all in a lot of parts of the country. And so to get rid of that as an assumption and instead start with what is the reality of the place people are running for office, or what is the reality of where the country is, before assuming, well, we need to temper things, as that Democrats need to like not go all the way, not be as bold. I think the other one that comes up a lot that I hear is that, well, why wouldn't someone just do it the right way? Like if there's, why can't, like, why is it that people don't just come, or people haven't immigrated? One is that there's it's very hard. Like, we have created a system that makes it extremely difficult, especially if you are from neighboring countries. Because we have sort of the way the Immigration Nationality Act in the 60s reformed the immigration system to be less racist, if you can imagine, because there was even less immigration from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and it was fully, biased towards Western Europe and Eastern Europe, was changed, but only so much. So it says, okay, there can only be a certain percentage from each part of the world or each country, so that no one gets more than another. That means a place like Mexico or Latin America or Venezuela, where my dad's from, if you have a lot of people seeking visas, over time there's a backlog because there's just so much more demand. We're closer, we have more family ties maybe. My dad had applied for his brothers almost 20 years ago as a sponsor for them, and never could get them through the system. I mean, it's gotten to be where it's too late. And that was before there was a dictatorship in Venezuela and the economic system that, sort of collapse that's taking place now. And so we're stuck. There's not really anything he can do for his family at this point, or people coming from Mexico, even if they have family here, the wait list can be 20 years or longer too, because the demand is so high. So that's, I think, one thing. And I also think there's this assumption like, well, we need to understand the whole immigration system to know how to fix it. And as people, as voters, as even myself as an advocate, like, I'm not an immigration lawyer. I am not ever going to be. I don't need to learn the whole system to know that it needs to be fixed, and that the people who that is their job need to do that, right? And that there are ways that we can say that still isn't right, but I don't have to like become an expert, and neither does every voter or anyone who wants to be an advocate for immigrant rights need to fully understand all the system to know that it's wrong, and to speak out for your neighbors. I think that's another thing I hear a lot of, like, well, but I need to better understand, or I want to know so that I can feel confident in advocating. It's like, we are not the ones who need to be the experts. There are policy experts, people like Dana and others who that's their day job, and we learn from them and take their trust, and also from the community, from the immigrant community itself, and follow their lead. That's a big thing that I think is really important in the coming year, that we follow the lead of the community that is advocating and leading itself rather than saying we know best or we know how to fix this. Yes, some of us have some expertise or knowledge maybe, but we should listen and take the lead from people like Diana and others who have been organizing and leading in their own community for many years, and who know what is best and what is needed. I would say the last thing is the assumption too that this system has been this way forever and that it can't be changed, or, well, we can only make marginal changes. We created it a lot. As Diana was saying, laws are man-made, they're people-made, right? Like it has changed over the years, and policy changes made in the 90s under a Democratic administration of the Clinton administration in 96 made the system that we're currently living in, where there are 3 and 10-year bans if people are deported, that have created permanent family separation, detention, criminalization that did not exist in that way before. So not only has it not always existed like this, it doesn't have to. And we don't have to start with the last version, or even before that. We can envision and imagine even better. And what would that look like?
I just want to second all of that. And thank you so much for bringing up the one that is the most common, where people say, well, just do it the right way. I encourage anyone and everyone to try to figure out how to immigrate to this country. You will be very confused. And another thing that I would just want to add to that particular piece is that our immigration system, as it stands, currently not only favors certain countries, but at the end of the day, if you really look at a big picture, it favors white, wealthy immigrants. One of the famous public charge rule that was very controversial under the Trump administration that my organization fought really hard against and took it to court and all these things was basically trying to prove before you even came to the U.S. you had to prove that you made a certain income, and there were a lot of other requirements, but at the end of the day it was basically saying, prove to us beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's no way you're ever going to be a public charge and use any public benefits, or just beyond public benefits, you just have to prove that you're never going to be a burden onto the government. And that is just preposterous, because obviously you might be coming to get a better life. So you might not have a job where you're at, but you're coming here and you know that will happen. There's just so many reasons why that's wrong. But at the end of the day, what that rule intends to do is to leave out anyone who's low income. And oftentimes, who are those folks? Oftentimes it's immigrants of color, right? And so the law is not set up in people's favor, and it's not set up to meet the needs of the world right now that we're living in. And it's not set up to favor, for example, family ties. And right now, I think we're in a time where we've all deeply and personally experienced separation from our loved ones. So just take that into consideration. If they're cutting what they call, I hate saying it, but chain migration, when they say that, they're talking about family immigration. So that means if you're separated from your family, they want to make sure that you don't get to be with them again. So just think about these past few months, this past year, how hard that has been on people. And imagine people who haven't seen their parents, their siblings in decades, who might experience a loss of a loved one and never get to go back and be with them. So just take all of that into mind when you're thinking about how our immigration system is really not set up to be rooted in people and what people need and deserve.
I completely agree with you, Diana. And really, really quickly before we transition to the final segment, I wanted to note that as an American citizen, you don't ever really encounter the immigration system. Like, I had no idea I was first introduced to it like in college. And so I had no idea that it went the way that it went. Like, never had it ever touched my life. But something that I do think is drastically underestimated by a lot of people is how expensive the process is, in a way that bodes absolutely nothing for it. Like, nothing. Like, people go through and spend thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars and never receive actual legalization, or it takes 20 to 25 years in order to do that. The lawyers are expensive. The forms are expensive. The court fees pile up. It's very, very expensive to go through the immigration process. And so then to turn around and demonize immigrants for not having money, right? Oh, you don't pay taxes. Oh, you don't have money. Oh, you don't contribute to our society. While at the same time exploiting them with these ridiculous fees. It really is overwhelming, allegedly, to be a system that's not that wants people to use it. Like it's supposed to, it's overwhelmingly expensive. It's not user friendly, and it's not at all something that I think anybody could point to as the best of bureaucracy. And so I wanted to go ahead and put that pin there because I think that's something that's really underestimated by people.
Thank you for adding that. I mean, even as a DACA, one to obtain legal status, yes, it is tens of thousands of dollars. So imagine how many people you're leaving out with that. And even as a DACA recipient, I have to pay almost $500 every 2 years. And it's constant. And for the past few years, it's been very uncertain. And can you imagine how many people in the country, U.S. citizen, DACA recipient or not, are living paycheck to paycheck? It may not sound like a lot every 2 years, but that is a lot. You're paying to have the privilege to work, to have the right to work. And if you happen to be living paycheck to paycheck, or heaven forbid an emergency comes up around the time you need to apply, what do you do? So yes, thank you for adding that.
Definitely. We can go ahead and transition into our final segment called Drunken Love, where I want to start with Sarah about essentially just 2 minutes for anything that you feel like really needs to be added to this conversation that we didn't get to earlier.
I mean, I think one thing I know I have not talked as much about and needs to be centered as well in the conversation on immigration is not just the racism, but the anti-Black racism and built into our immigration system. It's not part of it sort of hasn't been the focus of my work, but that doesn't mean it's not very central. And so it's not something that I always as intentional about bringing out, but I think needs to be something that we do think about and keep in mind of not just like racism generally, but anti-Black racism, and where the roots of that are, we know in our history in this country, and that is something that needs to be directly addressed as well. And there are ways that is happening just sort of through the proposals or that we hope will happen soon in the proposals that are there. But I think more intentionality around both anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and barriers to immigrating to the United States that we have put in place, and how do we intentionally undo that and decolonize our immigration system.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I think a lot of times people hear immigrant, they automatically assume Latino. That's not true. I encourage folks to follow an organization called Untaku Black. There are many Black immigrants in this country, and Asian American immigrants. There's just so many immigrants from all over the country, and we need to expand the conversation. The drunken love. I think the thing that I have been kind of like most recently just thinking about, wishing we could talk more about, it's starting to surface more into the conversation, but I really wish we could dive deeper into is mental health. Not just of obviously like immigrants, but but yes, definitely. Like just think of it from a big perspective of this is why policy needs to be people-centered, because policy inflicts trauma. All of this policy, like I have been learning so much about just mental health and things that happen to you as I'm in my own journey, just unpacking things and recognizing certain things as trauma and beginning to heal from things. And I just think of the kids who were separated at the border under the Trump administration and the lifelong trauma that they will now experience because of that. It just breaks my heart that we are not taking that into consideration, because if we did, we would really like understand that people, like the humanity of people, and if we centered our policies around people, if we took in mental health into consideration, then we would have different policies. So I think that's something we should be diving more into, just the trauma that we're inflicting on people.
Definitely, there's a lot of trauma associated there. And I think what I want to end off with is this idea that you will never, I think a lot of the conversation that's been had in the past has been that this needs to be a bipartisan effort, that, we've got to come together, all sides of the aisle have to be involved. And I'm never one to turn away allies. That's not like what I think you should do. At the same time, we also have to know that some of these people will never come along and will also never say that. And so if you're waiting on them to say like, oh no, it's just that we don't want immigration reform, they're not going to say that, right? But there's always going to be something. It's always going to be, oh, not this bill. Oh, not this person. Oh, not this circumstance or situation. It's always external, but understand that they're just not coming. And so I think what for people who do support immigration and immigration reform, you have to come up with what your vision is and be willing to stick to that and understand that. And also note that like white supremacy can look like a lot of different things, you know, and a lot of it is obsession with legality and right versus wrong and whether or not certain things that ultimately it's a desire for a country that is not welcoming to people who are not like them. And so something that I hope the Biden administration takes seriously is like, I think the actions of the previous administration towards immigration were egregious, horrendous, abysmal, I think. And to try and pretend like a lot of those same legislators who unfortunately were reelected will suddenly just turn over now because it's a new administration, or as though like that wasn't the real them. Like I believe it was, and get ready, because I don't think these people are going to suddenly be more amenable just because there's a different person in the White House. That's kind of where I'm leaving it. Sarah and Diana, I've enjoyed you both so much. I really wanted both of you to come on. I think y'all were great conversation partners for this topic. And in the event that someone, you know, wants to reach out or ask you about your work, Diana, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I want to apologize because I'm terrible at social media. I do have a Twitter account. I rarely ever post, but if you wanted to get a hold of me, I think that's probably the best way. My handle is just Diana P. Pliego. Happy to connect with folks through there.
Sarah, how about you?
Yeah, on Twitter, you can find me at Sarah Storyteller. And also, I don't post that often, but it's a great way to reach me and to see what I'm working on. And faithinpubliclife.org also is the organization I work at, and another way to reach me and follow the work that we'll be doing around immigration advocacy in the coming days and months.
Okay, then. Well, if you give me 1 second, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you both for being here today. That was this episode of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. If you want to reach out to me, you can follow me at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram. You can also follow Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered on Twitter and Instagram as well. I hope to see you soon. Thank you for tuning in to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered with host Lauren Zayu and music by Lighthouse Productions. For more information on Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered, or to review today's episode, please follow at Lauren Zayu on Twitter and Instagram, or subscribe to the Lauren Zayu YouTube channel.